Hi, everyone. Good night. Thanks for joining me. People who are connected virtually, thank you for joining us tonight. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. And people that are here, thank you, Lori. Thank you, Cara, for joining us tonight. My name is Marla Ramírez. I'm an assistant professor of history at UW-Madison. And I'll be presenting on my first book, Banished Citizens, A History of the Mexican-American Women Who Endured Repatriation. Am I on the frame in the back? Okay, good. Just checking for people who are connected virtually. I'll give the formal talk, and then at the end, we'll have time for questions and discussion. If you have any questions in the meantime, if you're connected virtually, make sure that you write your question on the chat box so that I can answer afterwards. And if you're here, we'll open up for discussion at the end. So let's start with the present. And I always tell my audiences that I like to start with the present moment in order to understand the past, right? To understand how we got to the current moment in terms of the topic of mass removals, we need to understand that the current mass deportations were not constructed in a vacuum, right? There's a longer history, there's precedents over the 20th century that lead us to the current moment. So currently, under Trump's second term, we have seen an increase on mass removals, mass deportations, right? That is not to say that it's a new phenomenon. We have had mass deportations every decade as long as we known the United States as a nation, right? The group that is targeted or is scapegoated for these mass removals had shifted over time. During the 19th century, it had been Germans, Italians, Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, depending on the political moment of the nation, right? And during the 1920s to 1930s, the period that I write about, it became Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Currently, it's immigrants of color, right? So in the current moment, we have an increase of mass removals that are targeting immigrants of color in specific job sectors. And these removals began in Los Angeles, California, Southern California, in summer of 2005. And here, this photograph is of a raid of a street vendor, a food vendor, right? And we have had raids in California that began in Los Angeles, spread throughout the state, and then throughout the nation. And specific sectors are being targeted, including farm working sectors, the milk industry here in Wisconsin, construction sectors, and service sectors, right? Do you know why that might be? I'll put you the people who are in the room on the spot. Why these job sectors, you think, are being targeted for deportation rates? They usually hire, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, oh, no, I was just going to say best guess. It's Mexican Americans, and that's kind of the political climate is.
Yeah. Yeah, so for people who are connected virtually, Lori in the audience said that it's usually Mexican Americans who are hired in these sectors or job sectors. That is true, but it's also people of color, right, who are perceived as immigrants. It doesn't mean that if you're a person of color, you're an immigrant automatically, right? I'm a person of color. I have a Mexican accent when I speak. I'm brown, I'm black hair, right? I'm short. So I fit the stereotype of a Mexican, right? And I say that stereotype of a Mexican because my husband is also Mexican, but he's also very white passing, right? So we come in all shades and colors, right? So that means that I will be more likely to be questioned by an immigration officer because my appearance tells immigration officers who might have a bias of who's a citizen, who's not, that I might be an immigrant, right? Even though I'm a naturalized citizen, right? But then people who are Canadians or who are Europeans who are here undocumented, they might not be questioned, even if they're undocumented immigrants, because they pass as white, and whiteness is always linked to the idea of citizenship in the United States. And so that's why these sectors have been targeted. Another thing that I want to highlight about the current moment that is different from the historical moment that I write about is that the immigration raids are taking place by ICE, which is the main immigration channel that enforces deportations. but also the US Border Patrol has been targeted enforcing these immigration raids in places like Madison, Oregon, Wisconsin, Chicago, Minnesota, California, in different cities, right? However, the US Border Patrol has authority to police borders, right? So either the Canadian-US border, the Mexico-US border, or our water borders that surround our nation, right? And they have authority in the border region and 100 miles within that region. However, under this administration, there's a shift that we're seeing where they are policing in the interior of the country, right? They're also enforcing deportations well beyond the 100-mile perimeter for any border. So I want to highlight these things to remind us that even though the current moment did not happen in a vacuum, there are things that change over time, right? So that is a new change that we hadn't seen in the period that I write about. There's also, in October of 2025, an investigation by ProPublica that recorded more than 170 US citizens who had been questioned, detained, and even removed from the United States, right? That is not new, right? And that makes the news in the headlines at least once a week, right? We're seeing reports about the current immigration deportations and the questioning of citizens. And again, because we operate in our immigration system through these biases, right? That we assume that people of color are always perceived as immigrants or foreigners, regardless of the legal status, right? That is not new. This is also a precedent that we have from the period that I write about between the Great Wars, between 1921 to 1944. So now that we understand the present in a more, in the general sense, let's go back into the past to understand how we got here, right? So even though Mexicans and Mexican Americans and other immigrants of color, usually working class because of the job sectors that I described, right, are working class jobs, are being targeted in the current moment. In the interwar period, again, the period between 1921 and 1944, it was Mexicans and Mexican Americans who were targeted as well, right? However, Mexicans were integrated into the United States in a significant number in 1848 as racially white. And I'll explain why that is important. And with access to US citizenship, right? So in 1848 marked the end of the US-Mexico War. The US-Mexico War took place between 1846 to 1848. And it was part of a period where the United States was undergoing expansion. I might invite you to think back to your high school years and think in your history class in high school, in your junior or senior year perhaps, you might have learned the term manifest destiny. Do you remember manifest destiny, right? This idea of God-given right to the United States to expand from sea to sea, right? That essentially is a mentality, or not a mentality, but the idea or the justification, the political justification that was used for colonization and expansion, right? So that we began with the 13 colonies and then expanded west and expanded south, right? As part of that expansion, these territories that were former Mexican territories became part of the United States, right? And so so Texas was already annexed during this period. And then Alta California, that encompasses multiple states in current Southwest United States, and New Mexico, that also encompasses multiple states in current Southwest United States, became part of the United States. So that the US-Mexico border moved to this region here, and then later moved again a bit downward to about right here as we know it today. So when I teach this topic to my students at UW-Madison, I always like to remind them that even though we assume that borders are fixed, right, that they are not. They have shifted political divides. And as political climate change and political influence changes, so do political borders, right? And so the US-Mexico border has shifted at least 3 times during the 19th century, right? And with those shifts, that meant that not only new territories were annexed into the United States, but also the people in those territories became part of the United States, right? So for Mexican citizens were integrated into the United States. And for the period that I write about between the Great Wars, 1921 to 1944, the question that Congress had was, what should we do with Mexican citizens who are part of this territory? Do we deport them south of the new US-Mexico border? Do we integrate them to the United States as slaves, because slavery was still legal during that period, right? Do we create a nation within the nation, like the United States did with Native American people, right? What should we do with them? These were political debates that were happening in the Senate floor in leading the years leading up to 1848, and then after 1848. At the end of the war in 1848, the Mexican government agreed to cede these territories to the United States in exchange of a transnational agreement. And the transnational agreement is known as the Peace Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Essentially, the Peace Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the war in a peaceful way, ceded the territories, and it established some rights and protections for the people that were annexed into these territories, into the United States, right? It included the guarantee of land ownership for people who own land in this territory, that the land was not going to be dispossessed of their rightful owners. And the other main, there's multiple other ones, but the other main one for the purposes of this talk today is that they will be integrated as US citizens, right? The issue with integrating Mexicans who are racially non-white, or were not considered racially white at the time, was that citizenship in the United States was a limited right in 1848. And I'm going to put people in the room again on the spot. So Lori and Kara, do you know who had the right to US citizenship in 1848?
White men landowners?
Yay, thank you, Kara. That's absolutely correct. And I'm saying yay, not because I'm celebrating who had the right to citizenship, but because you're right. Yes, so the answer for people who are connected virtually, Kara, our librarian, said that white men who own property had the right to US citizenship, and that's absolutely correct. So that meant that citizenship in the United States at the birth of our nation, and we're celebrating our 250th anniversary. So it's important to remember that when we were born as a nation in the United States, we had the construction of US citizenship, and a construction that was delineated across racial, gender, and class lines, right? So it was for white men, white folks, but men specifically, and if they own land, they had priority for citizenship, right? And that continued to be the case for many years. And then it was through political organizing and from the bottom up, right, that people were pushing to extend that right? Women's and the suffrage movement, formerly enslaved people, the civil rights movement, right? People, and different generations continue to push for the Native Americans, right? Continue to push for the expansion of access to U.S. citizenship as a right for people born here or who had been brought to the United States, right? So if in 1848 citizenship was limited to white men who own land, what was the right of white women? Again, putting people in the room on the spot.
It was like from your husband.
Yes.
Or father, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So women did not have the right to citizenship, even if they were white women, wealthy white women, right? We had a law known as coverture doctrine. And coverture essentially says that the right of a woman, or the political identity of a woman, is subsumed by that of her husband upon marriage. And that minor children are not understood as political actors under the law, right? So in other words, as Kara pointed out, women earn citizenship through fathers or husbands, and lasted through a husband too, or could lose citizenship through a husband. In other words, if a white woman was born as a US citizen, or any woman really was born as a US citizen because her father was a white man who owned land, then she will become a U.S. citizen. But that woman grew up, fell in love, and married an immigrant ineligible for citizenship, then that woman will lose her citizenship, right? So her political identity and her political voice and her political rights were dictated by the men in their lives, either their husbands or their fathers, right? And so we have to remember that for a few slides later in this presentation, so I'll bring you back to it. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that Mexicans will have that right to U.S. citizenship, and to be able to have a right to U.S. citizenship, they were racially classified as U.S. citizens for citizenship purposes only. So in other words, Mexicans were integrated into the United States as white people, racially speaking, right? Socially, however, they were never understood as equal partners or as an equal part of the national polity in the United States, right? And to access a right of citizenship, at the time, citizenship was dictated by states. So they had to go to courts and then demand or apply for citizenship. And every state, every city even, every courthouse had different regulations on how they will determine citizenship and whiteness, right? So lighter-skinned people and wealthier people and men, obviously only men had access to citizenship, but the wealthier, the lighter they were, the easier it was for them to prove that they were actually racially white. People that were darker skinned, indigenous, or of Asian descent in Mexico, or black descent in Mexico had a harder time accessing US citizenship. Nonetheless, 150,000 or an estimated 150,000 people annexing these territories became US citizens in 1848 and years after. And then people were recruited into the United States for labor needs throughout the 19th century and early 20th century, so the population of ethnic Mexicans in the United States continued to increase. Nonetheless, only 7 decades later, after the signing of the Peace Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the annexation of former Mexican territory into the United States, Mexicans were scapegoated as responsible for the ills of the nation. So it was 1921, the end of the First Great War, and Mexicans had been recruited to the United States, who increased the population of Mexicans already living in the United States. They had been recruited to the United States to labor during the First Great War. As American men were going off to war, they were labor shortages, and they were highly recruited for the railroad system, construction and maintenance, farming and agriculture, mining, and construction sectors, right? And so at the end of the war, there was an economic recession, as it usually happens at the end of any war, right? And so Mexicans were then seen as a problem in the United States, in the one hand. But on the other hand, some Mexicans who had been recruited here for labor wanted to return home, right? Employers had recruited the workers to come to the United States to work for short-term labor contracts, right? And they were promised transportation to the United States and then transportation back to Mexico once their contracts were over. However, at the end of the war, the end of the First Great War, employers faced a recession, and they decided that they couldn't afford to pay transportation back for those workers that they had recruited. So these Mexican workers contacted their consuls or consulate offices and asked the Mexican government for help to repatriate, to return to the homeland, right? And so the Mexican government stepped in and then gave a helping hand to people who were stranded here, workers who were stranded here, and then they paid the one-way ticket back to Mexico, right? So that's the essence of repatriation, a voluntary process of return to the homeland. And it has to be initiated by the worker, or the citizen themselves, and then the country of birth can step in and then help the citizen abroad come back home, right? And again, the key here is it has to be voluntary. Then fast forward a few years after 1921, and social workers realized that there is now an established process of return, that the Mexican government is paying one-way tickets from the United States to Mexico for Mexican workers, and the Mexican workers are willingly leaving the United States. And they said, well, we have, bless you, we have an economic recession here. Why don't we replicate this repatriation program and expel quote-unquote unwanted immigrants from the United States, right? And then social workers then collaborated with local police officers and INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, that is now, that we now know as ICE. And then that continued throughout the 1921 to throughout the 20s. And then in 1930, those efforts intensified. In the 1930s, we have the Great Depression. And with the Great Depression, the economic recession was even bigger, right? And so we have this photograph from 1931 that is now of the infamous Placita Olvera raid in Los Angeles, California. So not so surprisingly, the current immigration rates that I showed you in a few slides earlier that began in summer 2005 also began in Los Angeles, California. And in 1931, when these removals intensified, they also began, what is it? In Los Angeles, California. Question? Oh, no, not 2005, 2025. Thank you for catching my mistake there. So in the current moment, in 2025, we began in Los Angeles, California, in 1931, also in Los Angeles, California. And I say not surprisingly, because Los Angeles, California has historically and currently been the home to a large sector of immigrants of color, working class immigrants of color. And largely, historically and currently, a large sector of those immigrants of color are ethnic Mexicans or Mexicans, right? And so when targeting Mexicans, Los Angeles, California has been the target, right? And so in 1931, there were plainclothed police officers and immigration officers who surrounded La Plaza. And La Plaza is a public space where people just gather to socialize, right? And it still is a functioning plaza that is a historic center now. And 400 people were interrogated and questioned for hours and they were asked to prove that they were actually US citizens or had legal permission to be in the United States. And the way that you prove that you're a US citizen is through a birth certificate. And at the time, it was very common to also have a baptismal record to prove that you were a US citizen. But people didn't walk around with their baptismal record or their birth certificate. Even now, we don't walk around with those documents, but those are the most common ways to prove that you are a US citizen, right? And so people didn't have those things in their person, those documents in their person. So because they didn't, they weren't allowed to go home or have somebody else bring those documents to them. Instead, they will walk across really to the nearest train station and put in trains by the thousands at different rates. Here, only a handful of them. Welcome, hi. And they were putting trains and remove to Mexico. And then once in Mexico, people who were removed then carried the burden to prove that they were actually here legally or they were US citizens, and then they had to pay their way back to the United States, right? And convince immigration officers that they were, they should be allowed to return to the United States. And so when I began doing the research for this book, I had read a lot about this historiography, the literature about this topic, right? The documents a lot, the documents a topic of repatriation. Remember that I told you that it began as a voluntary process of return, right? Mexican workers who had been recruited here for labor, and then they wanted to go back home. And so a lot of the literature focuses on that experience of Mexican workers who were being returned voluntarily at the beginning, and then it became a coerced movement of removal, right? And so even though men were highly documented and took a significant part of the population who were removed, in the archival records, when I went through the archives here in the United States and in Mexico to investigate this study, I kept seeing data about men and historic photographs about men. And you can see here a lot of men were being removed, right? But then I also kept seeing hints about women and children, right? And in this bench, we can see a few mothers and their children sitting on their laps or beside them. And I wanted to know what happened to these women and children, right? So my research question at the beginning of this project was, if men were removed in mass, right? And if they were married to US citizens or had US citizen children, what happened to those US citizens? Were they entangled in these removals and removed along with them? Or were they allowed to stay behind in the United States, right? And if so, did they become transnational families? Or how did they function as a family, right? So that's how I began the project. As I continue on working on this research, I found out that for the period of 1921 to 1944, 1 million, or approximately 1 million people were removed from the United States, and externally 60% were US citizens. So my question shifted quickly, right? My research question shifted to not only wondering if US citizens were removed or not, because now I had the answer based on the preliminary research and the historiography, because some of the studies had already begun to document the experiences of US citizens who were removed. And so the question became, then what happens when US citizens are so convincingly perceived as foreigners that they are removed from the native country? What is the meaning of citizenship if your racial appearance can then erase that right? And then if you're caught in an immigration raid and then you're removed from the United States. And then I also wanted to know, were they able to return to the United States, right? And if they were not able to return to the United States, were they able to pass on their citizenship to their children if they were in Mexico, right? Were there any prolonged consequences across generations, right? And then as I continued to research, I found out that as I explained at the beginning, right, do you remember conversion doctrine? Yeah, no? I'll explain for you. Yeah, conversion doctrine is the political law, really. It was a precedent of law that stated that women, the political identity of women was subsumed by that of their husbands upon marriage, right? Remember that US citizenship was created as a right for white men who own land, so across racial, gender, and class, racial, and gender lines, right? And then women could only access citizenship through their husbands or their fathers, right? And so being a white woman, a wealthy white woman, did not give you political protection, right? You could only have access to political identity through your father. And if you married a foreigner ineligible for citizenship, then you will lose your citizenship, right? So that women had no political voice under the law, right? And minor children did not either. And that is a conversion doctrine was in effect throughout the 19th century, and it was overturned at the end of the 19th century, right? These expulsions began in 1921, after conversion doctrine was already overturned. Nonetheless, the legacies of conversion doctrine were brought back into life to justify removing US citizen women and children, under the idea that that women belong with their fathers and children belong with their mothers. And as such, entire mixed status families, as we refer to them today, should be removed together. So that if the head of the household was a Mexican immigrant, labeled as likely to become a public charge, and I'll explain what likely to become a public charge means more in detail in a minute, and he was married to US citizen women and had US citizen children, they must follow him out through his removal from the country, right? Was that legal? No. Did we change immigration law? No. Did we introduce a new rule of how to remove mixed status families? No. But yet, in practice, at the ground, immigration officers had incredible discretion on how to enforce the law, and they continue to do to this date, right? And because of the political climate of the economic recession in the 1920s and the Great Depression during the 1930s, then politicians turned a blind eye to these removals on both sides of the border, because it was a transnational effort, an agreement between the US government and the Mexican government that I'll explain again more in detail in a few slides. So when I was in the archives here in the United States, in Washington, D.C., the National Archives, and then in Baltimore, I came across lists of the documented these removals. They became significant to the way they understood banishment. This list documents the person's name, their sex, their age, their nationality, and their relationship to the head of household, who's a Mexican male who was being removed, right? The fact that a person's nationality is documented and not their legal status is significant, because a person can be a Mexican national, but then be naturalized as a U.S. citizen, or have a legal visa to reside here in the United States, or be here as a temporary worker with the worker's visa to be here in the United States. For instance, I'm a Mexican national, but I'm also a naturalized U.S. citizen, right? If I was to be listed as a Mexican national in this list, you will never know that I'm also a U.S. citizen, right? So that obscures the legality of removing Mexican nationals too, right? Mexican who were understood as Mexican immigrants. They might not have been repatriated. They might have already been U.S. citizens too, right? Or have any legal status here in the United States. And so we also see that the vast majority of people, those in the red boxes, were U.S. citizens. Those were the 60% out of the 1 million who were U.S. citizens. So as you can see in this fuller list, the head of household, the Mexican immigrant father or husband, was always listed as a Mexican national and likely to become a public charge. Likely to become a public charge means that a person is unemployed, that is destitute, or is asking, or is sick and dependent on health services, right? So health services and relief services, or relief aid, what we know as welfare today, were considered to be, could label a person as likely to become a public charge. And if they were unemployed, they also listed as likely to become a public charge. And the likely to become a public charge was a clause in the 1917 Immigration Act that was used. It was only a few years after it took effect in 1921 when these removals began. And so the 1917 Immigration Act stated that if a person was likely to become a public charge or became one 3 years after their arrival to the United States, then they were deportable from the United States, right? So that clause was used for these removals, which if a person had been here 3 years or less, then they could be removed, right, if they were likely to become a public charge. Many of these men, even if we only know their nationality, they already had children in the United States who were 8 years, 11 years, 18 years, 15 years, right? Meaning or indicating that they had been here for more than 3 years, right? And so that clause was used to expel people who had been here long term, also was an oversight of the law, right? And another thing that is significant is that the wives were usually U.S. citizens, as we can see in these boxes here, in the first two boxes, and then here, and then this box. But sometimes they were also Mexican nationals themselves, right? However, the children were always U.S. citizens, right? And remember, nationality indicates citizenship status, right? So in these cases, it was the immediate family who was removed, right? As long as they had a Mexican head of household who was a Mexican national likely to become a public charge. The wife and the children then were removed with him. In other cases, like the one in Pedro Cruz's family, who was a Mexican national head of household, entire extended family was removed. Pedro was married to Isabel Martinez, who was a U.S. citizen, and they had a set of U.S. citizen children, adult children, who had married, daughter-in-law, and then son-in-law, who were all U.S. citizens, and they had their own sets of children, or the grandchildren of Pedro and Isabel. You can see here the grandson and the granddaughter. And everybody in the family across multiple generations is a U.S. citizen, except for the head of household. And yet the entire extended family across 3 generations was expelled, right? This is the extent of the discretion that immigration officers had for these mass removals. And thus, not surprisingly, that 1 million people were removed, and the 60% of them were U.S. citizens. If you're shocked, that's the right reaction, Kara.
That's what, the son-in-law?
Yes, the son-in-law and the daughter-in-law.
The son-in-law who was a citizen in his own right.
Yes. So coverture, right, took away the right of women and children, but in some cases, it took out the right of other U.S. citizen men too, right? Because they had links to the targeted head of household who was a Mexican national, right? So the extension of coverture had a wide reach during this period, right? So that's why, yes?
What was that law that ended in the, sorry, I'm taking notes.
Oh, yeah, please.
What was that, the law that ended in the 19th century that they were still using?
Coverture.
What was the two words for
Coverture
it?
doctrine. So it's,
Okay, oh, thank
yeah.
you, Dr. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
That was what I couldn't remember. Thank
Yeah, it's Coverture.
you. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So because of coverture doctrine and because of the high reach of the likely to become a public charge and how it was reinterpreted during this period, right? I don't use the term deportation to describe these mass removals, which refers to the expulsion of a non-citizen person to their native country through a legal process. And that was happening at the time. That we had deportations between 1921 to 1944, but most people were not removed through a deportation process where they had a right to see an immigration attorney and to present their case before an immigration judge. Instead, they were just put in train loads by the hundreds from hospitals, from if they asked for relief assistance, what we know now as welfare assistance, from public spaces like plazas, right? From dance halls, from schools, from courts. If that sounds familiar, it's because that's what is happening today is using the precedent of this period, right? How do we target people through fear tactics so that we target thousands, but then millions can be affected and pushed to voluntarily remove, right? That is called coercion, really, if they're being pushed through fear tactics to leave the country. And some scholars have used the term repatriation, which represents a return of a non-citizen immigrant to their homeland or patria as a voluntary process. And even though that happened, and it was how this movement began in the early 1920s, right? As the movements became a national effort, they were not voluntary. And repatriation, remember that I explained at the beginning, must be voluntary, right? People who are in a foreign country can voluntarily ask their native country for help to return home. But what was happening in the period that I write about, and the families that I document in my book, they did not want to leave the country. It was not a voluntary process. They were coerced to leave. As such, I use the term banishment to precisely refer to these mass removals for what they were. A coerce is a sanctioned expulsion of U.S. citizens to their erroneously designated quote-unquote home country. That was usually the ethnic country of origin. So it was a home country of their parents or grandparents, or sometimes their great-grandparents, but not their own home country, right? So it's as if we're saying, let's deport Germans from Wisconsin, right, who have been here for generations, and they have a long-rooted presence in the United States. And so did ethnic Mexicans in many states throughout the United States, including California and the annexed territories, right? But removing Germans from Wisconsin will mean removing them, many of them, to their ethnic country of origin. Their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents might be born in Germany, but they're now natives of Wisconsin and the United States, right? Similar things were happening at the time, right? So banishment then highlights this irony of assuming that a person's ethnicity is their nationality or their citizenship. So even though these mass removals began in California, in Los Angeles to be precise, and then spread to other California, and then to those states highlighted in green, because that's where ethnic Mexicans concentrated in larger numbers, including here in the Midwest, Illinois, and Indiana, where they have been recruited for labor. Later studies document that it's not a story of California, it's not a story of the Southwest, or even a story of limited Southwest regions, that these removals happen throughout the United States, including these red states, as far east as New York, as far south as Alabama, and even in Alaska, where ethnic Mexicans were recruited to fish and can salmon during this period. So this is a history, not of California, not of the Southwest, it's a history of the United States, right? And it's still, it's surprising to me as a historian that many of my colleagues who are trained in history don't know about this topic. And many of my students and then audiences in public settings like a library that we are today, whenever I present, they always tell me that they had no idea of this topic, right? And there's many dark chapters in our history, but we must know our history, right? We must learn again to draw on Germany from our hard past to be able to be better citizens in the present and into the future, right? Germany doesn't hide away from the dark history of the Holocaust, right? If you're in Berlin, they have public museums where everybody can learn about this history, regardless of formal education. You don't have to be in a college classroom to learn about this history. You can walk in your daily routine to work or what have you, and you can read about this history, right? And I think it's a great lesson that we can borrow from, that it's only through knowing the dark chapters in our history that we can create better chapters in the present and better chapters in the future, right? And so the train system, or trains specifically, became the preferred mode of removal for this episode of mass removals, because the railroad system had railroad lines that passed through the regions where ethnic Mexicans concentrated in mass. So it facilitated just putting people in train loads and then removing them from anywhere in the interior of the United States into the US-Mexico border. And ironically, Mexicans had helped construct these very railroads and maintain them alongside Black workers and Chinese workers. And the United States paid for the transportation of people into the border region of the US-Mexico border. And then the Mexican government paid for the transportation from the border region into the interior of the country, making this a true transnational effort. And the reason why the Mexican government was invested in these removals was because they had this romanticized notion that Mexican workers who had labored in the United States and their families who were US citizens had gained a specific skill set that they can bring to Mexico in agriculture, farming, railroad, and mining, and help industrialize Mexico and help Mexico come out of the recession and later the depression. However, funds were needed to put that plan into action, right? You needed to invest in equipment and to help people start anew, build homes, and absorb that 1 million people were coming to Mexico, and the funds weren't there because this was a global recession and a global depression, right? So Mexico was also affected by it. So it became more of a romanticized notion, never fully implemented. But also Mexico was interested in using these removals to create a political discourse that could unite a divided nation. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 had divided the nation across racial and class lines. And so the different Mexican governments at the time, during this period, thought that if they blamed the United States as the country who was victimizing ethnic Mexicans, then they can unite people in Mexico to say, look at our sisters and brothers in the exterior, they're being demonized and abused by the US government. Let's come together and welcome our compatriots with open hands, and then that kind of political discourse will then help the nation come together instead of continuing to be divided. And it worked, actually, to some extent. And so that's why the Mexican government was also invested in this transnational effort of mass displacement. To conclude, I want to highlight how my book is divided. Every chapter, the book has 5 main body chapters, and 4 of the main body chapters focuses in one family. And the reason I organized it across families is because, like I explained in the beginning, I wanted to highlight and understand the effects of banishment, not only for people who were US citizens and banished at the time, but also the prolonged effects across 3 generations. So every family highlights the matriarch who was removed, and then their children and grandchildren, and the effect that they still endure into the present, 3 generations later. Chapter 1 documents the history of the Rodriguez family, and I interview Trinidad's family. And she spent 47 years in banishment in Jalisco, Mexico. She was banished from Redlands, California, and spent her whole life trying to come back to the United States. Unfortunately, she passed away unexpectedly at a young age. And her 2 children in Mexico who were born there were not able to access citizenship, derivative citizenship through her. And then her children had their own set of children, some of who came to the United States to work as undocumented immigrants, and they continue to be, some of them, as undocumented immigrants here today, even though their paternal grandmother is a US citizen. And her children are coming to the United States with a tourist visa to visit their own children, right? So the irony of denial of citizenship and the question, or the assumption rather, that people sometimes have, that they think, oh, people are here as undocumented immigrants because they don't respect the law, right? Or they don't want to go through the immigration process. Sometimes the law is the one that didn't respect them, right? That deny citizenship to them. And even though they could have a potential line through citizenship, banishment meant that they will be denied the derivative citizenship and make them into undocumented immigrants. So in that chapter, I theorized the term transgenerational illegality, how illegality is imposed onto citizens who were removed and then into their children and grandchildren instead of imposing derivative citizenship. In chapter 2, I have the Anda family. I interview Consuelo and Virginia de Anda, who are photographed here as children before their banishment. This is the last photograph the family has before they were removed. They spent 23 years in Zacatecas in banishment before they were able to come back to the United States. They were able to reestablish their citizenship and then bring their children with them to the United States, and they were able to access citizenship as well. In chapter 3, I document the Robles family. I interview Sarah Marie here with the braids. She spent 33 years in banishment in Zacatecas. And again, she also spent a lot of time trying to convince her husband to come back to the United States. Ironically, conversion doctrine expelled her from the United States. And then in Mexico, the practice of conversion, even though it wasn't legal either at the time, but the husband had a say in her movement, right? And her husband, her father had a copy of her birth certificate. And then when she married, he gave it to her husband and said, this is her birth certificate if you ever want to go to the United States. And even though Trinidad asked her husband to come to the United States, he didn't want to come to the United States. And it wasn't until she won her case after pleading with her husband, then she was able to come by herself because she had the legal capital of US citizenship, right? And then she became, historically, it is men who cross borders and then they establish themselves and then they stay for their family. Because Sarah Marie had access to citizenship, she came to the United States first, established herself, worked, saved money, and then sent for her husband and then her children a few at a time. And then also open immigration petitions for them, even though they could benefit from derivative citizenship and go into an American consulate, either in Mexico or the United States, and then register them before they turned 21. She wasn't aware that she has this right, and many of the families didn't. So then they thought that they had to open traditional family petitions that are prolonged and expensive, right? And so it took 12 years for her to reunite her family in the United States. The last chapter, chapter 4, or the second to last, is Espinosa family, and I interview Ramon Espinosa, her children and grandchildren. She was banished to Sinaloa because she was banished to Sinaloa first. Let me back up. She was banished to Sinaloa first, and then her family moved to Mexicali, which is a border town with the United States, because families were told in this coercion of removal that they were going to be removed for 1 year. And then after a year, they could come back to the United States, right? But and it was a misleading information. That was never the intention of removal for 1 year. The intention was for these removals to be permanent. And to make them permanent, immigration officers and social workers will confiscate people's identity documents, their birth certificates if they were US citizens, or the baptismal records if they were US citizens, to prevent them from being able to come back to the United States, or at least slow down the process of them being able to come back to the United States. And that was a case for some other families. The Espinosa family was able to hold on to their birth certificates and baptismal records. And so the mother then took her 4 children to Mexicali to cross the border into the United States, but they were denied re-entry, even though all the children had birth certificates, but the mother did not. She was not a US citizen. And so then they settled in Mexicali, hoping that in a few months or in a few years, they will be allowed to then return again. But it took 16 years before she was allowed to return. And it was only allowed to return because of World War II, when the U.S., different employers in the United States, including farm labor, were recruiting workers again for labor shortages. So she was recruited from Mexicali to come to the United States to labor in California as a farm worker, and then eventually resettle herself. Chapter 5 is the redress recommendations, where I asked the families for what would they ask if they could ask the U.S. government or the Mexican government for any reparations, any redress for the injustices that they endured, right? So this chapter documents their own recommendations from their own experiences, given that they went through banishment. Many people ask for commemoration, plaques, like Germany has done, public commemoration. Other people ask for to include this history in K through college education, that they want people to learn this history because it's still largely unknown, as we discussed earlier, right? Other people ask for monetary redress, even though very few of the families or members of families wanted monetary redress. Many of them said there's no price tag that you can put into what happened to us, right? Other families who have members who are still undocumented immigrants want a path to legalization, right? If they can prove that they are a direct descendant of a banished U.S. citizen, there should be a path for them to adjust their legal status to access U.S. citizenship. Other people wanted tangible proof that this happened to them, right? A letter of recognition, right? That it was a mistake, that the U.S. government, the Mexican government, unjustly displaced thousands and thousands of families during this period. California actually became the first state and only state in the United States, and in Mexico for that matter, who has formally apologized for their involvement in this mass displacement of ethnic Mexicans and mixed status families. And it was because many of the families who endured this displacement came together and organized with Senator Dunn of California, and then the law was introduced and then voted in and signed by former Governor Schwarzenegger in 2007. And in 2012, this plaque was commemorated outside La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, which is adjacent to La Placita Olvera, where the famous immigration raid that I showed you at the beginning took place. So it's a historical site, a historic site, and it narrates a history of this displacement, both in English and Spanish. And now that we continue to have these immigration arrests and deportations at a massive scale, including here in Wisconsin, right, in places like Oregon and Madison, it's more important than ever to know this history, to be aware of how we got to this moment, and not only that there's a playbook of how to do this, because there's a lot of parallels of what happened in the past that are being used for these current immigration mass removals, but also how the families responded to the moment and the effect that they endured, so that we also have a playbook of how we can respond to this moment, right? So if you want to learn more, you can go to Harvard University Press. There's more details about the book. Also, I always tell audiences, never pay full price. There's a 30% discount if you use RAM30 when you checked out at Harvard University Press. But we have free copies for you all. So the first 20 people to arrive get a free copy. So everybody's getting a free copy. People who are connected electronically, talk to Cara, our amazing librarian. There's copies for you to come and pick up. And now we can open for questions. Thank you for your time and attention. If there's any questions.
What these banishments were coordinated and I imagine expensive, both for the United States and for Mexico. Was the benefit to the United States solely getting brown people out of its citizenship ranks?
Yeah.
That was the primary goal and purpose?
Yeah, good question, Cara. So the question is for the audience who is on the virtual side. what was the benefit for the U.S. government? What were they invested? It must have been an expensive venture to remove 1 million people. Why would they go through this process of removing people, paying that one-way ticket on train systems? It was multi-layer, right? It was sold as the political discourse that was sold to the public at the time was as part of the economic recovery, that removing immigrants could save jobs for the serving Americans, right? Again, we're hearing that discourse today, right? Immigrants are stealing jobs from citizens, or serving citizens. Immigrants are taking advantage of public services, a welfare system. Same tired discourse, right? And the idea that brown people are immigrants, right, is also a tired discourse that we see 60% that were U.S. citizens, similar to today, right? A lot of brown people, the majority of brown people are not immigrants, right? And even if they were, at the time, they were entitled to public services. They were and today and in the past, they're hired for immigrant labor, right? So they were brought to the United States, but then when the crisis carried on, then they were seen as unwanted or as scapegoated as a problem, right? And then removed. So it was sold politically. The political discourse was sold as an economic recovery during the economic crisis after the Great War and then in the Great Depression. The actual root of why the United States was invested in this mass displacement was because in 1920 and then in 1930s, the United States was reinventing itself as a white settler nation, right? That they wanted to reinvent themselves across racial lines and to understand themselves as a white nation. But to do so, they needed to then remove immigrants of color, right? Or people of color who had access, had gained access to citizenship. And the population of ethnic Mexicans who had access to citizenship was on the quick rise. Not only because of annexation and they gained citizenship that way, but also because they had been here for generations now, and then they had children who were being born as U.S. citizens, and those children were marrying U.S. citizens and then having their own sets of U.S. citizens, as I show you on that list, right? So that was a direct threat to this idea of a white settler nation. That if we have citizens who are non-white, then how do we then understand ourselves as a white nation, right? And this is the 1920s is a period of where eugenics was on the rise. Eugenics is pseudoscience that now has been debunked, right? That pure whiteness yields to better quality humans, right? That obviously we understand is racist and problematic, right? But this eugenics was on the rise, and so these ideas of reestablishing or reimagining, reconstructing the United States as a white nation was informed by eugenics. So all that is explained in more detail in the book. But yeah, that is the complicated reality of why they went through this expensive process. And even though it was very expensive, the social workers who were orchestrating these mass removes at the ground at the local level, and then supported by local police officers and INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, enter agreements with train companies. And then train companies said, if you have a group of 100 or more, we'll give you discounted tickets, which not only reduced the price of removal, but also increased the number of people who were being removed. And that's why we reached this very large number of more than 1 million people who were removed from the United States between 1921 and 1944. And then, like I explained, the interest of the Mexican government was also political. And so also they were willing to invest the money to then remove Mexicans or bring Mexicans from the border into the interior. That's an excellent question, Kara. Thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Do you think women getting the right to vote in, was it 1919 or was it 1920, also pushed some of this because
Yes.
they're like, oh, there's a woman who's married to a Mexican national and she can vote, so
Yeah.
if we deport them all, then we can get back to this white nation.
Definitely. Women, specifically ethnic Mexican women who were U.S. citizens, represented a triple threat, right? They were U.S. citizens. They were gaining the political right to vote and have a political voice in the nation for the first time, right? And they were afraid that they would vote against the interests of the majority, right? And they were also, if they had reproductive abilities, they were also able to reproduce children who then were born as U.S. citizens of Mexican origin. So the idea of women's political voice, newly gained political right to vote, and then the ability to reproduce children meant that they were seen as a principal target of removal. And like I explained at the beginning, the removals first targeted men, and they were removing men, right, first. But if they were married to U.S. citizen women or had U.S. citizen children, what immigration officers found and social workers found was that if they removed Mexican men to Mexico, and usually at the beginning they were being removed to border towns, and I'll show you the map here. Wait, I went back too far. Maybe, okay, here. So they were removed to the border town south of the U.S.-Mexico border. But soon enough, if they had U.S. citizen women or children, they were coming back into the United States because they had ties to family in the United States. So the target then the approach shifted. And so it the approach was not to target Mexican men, but to target Mexican-American women, U.S. citizen women. And removing the U.S. citizen women meant that they could remove the husbands and the children too, right? So it was an approach to remove entire mixed status families. Yeah, so thank you for the question. Other questions? Do you have any questions on the chat? Okay.
I read this book a few months ago called Safe Passage by Evelyn Iritani, and it's about the same thing during the war, where they were basically, through coercion, banishing mostly Japanese citizens, or mostly American citizens,
right,
back to Japan.
World War II,
and it kind of, it feels like, and I don't know in your research if you found this, it feels like this was like the blueprint for this. Right?
Yes, and remember we haven't been formally introduced. What's your name? Katie. Katie, thank you for the excellent question, and I'll repeat it for people who are connected virtually. Katie asked, or shared that she read a book, and remind me the title? Safe Passage, that documents the experiences of Japanese Americans who were banished essentially during World War II, right? So a bit later after the period that I document. So the question that Katie presents is, was this episode of mass removals a blueprint for later removals of banishment? The answer that I will argue, yes. Actually, this gives me an opportunity, Katie. Thank you for discussing that topic of my second book. So now that I'm done with this book, I know, they just keep us going, right? Now that I'm done with this book, as part of being a professor, you're required to continue doing research and publication. So I'm developing the second book project, and it's very early on, obviously. I just finished this one. But the second book project looks at how banishment became essentially this blueprint for other episodes of mass removals. The closest example of the mass removals of mixed status families that included U.S. citizens, right? So the closest example is that of Japanese Americans during World War II. There was very few years after banishment took place of Mexican Americans, right? So Japanese were seen as quote unquote the enemy of the interior during the Second World War. They were misunderstood as having political loyalties to Japan, and then they were seen as a potential threat to be spies of Japan in the United States, and so they were seen as a threat, and so then incarcerated in concentration camps, and then some of them were actually removed from the United States, banished essentially because they were citizens. Oh. A tornado? Tornado alert. Welcome to Wisconsin. Oh.